in the ground. I put me 6 foot down and let the stone say, here lies the girl whose only crutch is loving one man just a little too much. If you go before I do, I'm gonna tell the grave digger that he better dig too.
Hey everyone. I thought I would try experimenting with some genres outside of my usual nerd fare. Let me know what you think and if you'd like to see a more diverse array of works. That said, I decided to start out with a Southern Gothic story that most people probably remember from high school. A Rose for Emily is a 1930 short story by William Faulkner. The story describes an aristocratic white woman named Emily Grierson, as seen from the perspective of the gossiping white townsfolk. Emily is far from a standard woman of the era, bucking the patriarchal tradition of her social class, and achieving a near independency even as she fulfills the expectations of a member of the ruling class, in holding power over the less fortunate. She also just happens to be a cold-hearted murderer. The story is written in a plural first-person account, as the townspeople visit her mansion for her funeral and muse about her life in a non-linear fashion, and then become aware of just how creepy she really is. There's a note about how old Southern gentlemen dress in Confederate uniforms to honor her because they think that they knew her during the time of Civil War, but are confused because old men only see the last decade clearly and see the past beyond that as blurred together. This sentiment is echoed in the narrative, where the townspeople's memory of her is composed into a series of anecdotes that tell her life out of sequence until it reaches her final decades. I'll make it simpler by forcing it into chronological order. Early in Emily's life, she and her father are the last remnants of a family of Southern aristocrats, effectively rendering them an example of genteel poverty, too good to deal with worldly affairs, but eventually reduced to owning little more than their decaying home. Throughout her youth, Emily's father refuses to agree to any marriage, until Emily effectively becomes an old maid, assuming a status of social stigma throughout much of history, even as she remains theoretically respectable because of her family ties. As a remnant of the antebellum South, she represents Southern history in the way that it's shown respect in that society. She is likened to a monument. The town even took care of her like a monument. They helped shelter her from the harshness of reality, and helped her out with various troubles happening around her. Her grieving over her father, a straying boyfriend, a weird smell ruining her mansion's respectable appearance, and even the burden of taxes. Following her father's death, the mayor felt sad for her and allowed her to not pay taxes under the excuse that he was repaying a loan from her father. She essentially broke the law in evading taxes for several years, but the townspeople allowed her to do so.
You know, the only one that cares about my tax returns are the reporters.
As it was the mayor to relieve her of that responsibility, I imagine that he paid for her share with the taxes of the town. In a sense, the town was taxed to maintain her, like she really was a Southern historical monument to white supremacy, but we'll get to that later. After the mayor eventually left the picture, presumably through him dying of old age, the arrangement stopped. Taxmen came to collect, but she got around it by pleading ignorance and using her social status to walk all over them. The townspeople characterize her as especially gullible because she is female, repeating a sexist idea, but I think the author implies that she knew what she was doing, and mostly succeeded because of her social status, and the fact that everyone was really reluctant to actually go after a woman of her standing. Throughout the story is a thread of racism. She was born in a time when slavery was a thing, and she brings that sensibility to the present. She kept a black manservant all her life, who it's implied she didn't pay because she didn't have the money, and just let him stay on her land. So basically, she kept a slave. Following her death, his prospects don't look too good. There are other various references to racism occurring in the town and being maintained by the ruling class. I imagine the author did so critically. While a product of his racist circumstances known to have been racist himself, Faulkner appears to have generally tried to shed light on racism. As such, he features racist characters as a thematic element. Emily's greatest betrayal of her status, however, comes in the form of a man named Homer Barron, a Yankee laborer with whom she begins a relationship. It's important to remember that this period, Reconstruction, was one of great resentment towards northern carpetbaggers, who were seen as sympathetic to black people, and generally a threat to the Southern way of life. The idea that a Southern lady would date one was horrifying. The idea that they would take public rides out on Sunday was downright unthinkable. Homer is described in a somewhat racist way. He is a white guy, of course, but described as unusually dark, a feature that coincides with his bad personality traits. I picture him as like a really tan Gaston. Furthermore, he describes himself as not a marrying man, likely conveying the perspective of Northerners as dishonorable. Completely incidental to this, Emily proved her own personal strength when she went to buy something for herself instead of sending her manservant. She held her head up high and marched out to the pharmacy and got herself a bag of arsenic. When the pharmacist demanded she tell him what she would use it for, she said nothing, and he decided to write it down that it was for rats. The collective narrator doesn't seem to realize, or at least admit, what she wanted it for, speculating that she was considering suicide, but the implication seems to be that the pharmacist agreed with her that rats, who would run off with some other lady, should die, and helped her see to that end. This indicates loyalty between members of the townsfolk and this member of the ruling class, where they help her get away with stuff or are otherwise unwilling to suspect her of wrongdoing. Sometime after this incident, a really awful smell came from her place. The townsfolk blamed the manservant both because he's black and presumed to be incompetent, and because he's a man and presumed not to understand how to maintain a kitchen, despite having been a servant his whole life. An interesting vertex in intersectionality. Typically, the overlapping identities of black and woman would be the significant problem. But this is an instance of black and man because of the restrictiveness of gender roles. The purview of intersectional feminism would cover it, but it's an uncommon manifestation of the overlap of racism and sexism, and an instance of why feminism is good for men too. Of course, class is a big reason why no one suspects Emily of causing the smell herself. But her race and gender does come into play for why no one thinks that she would be an actor in a case like this, where the cause of the smell is something too terrible to think about. As a rich white woman, she is characterized as holding a permanent innocence, while everyone just blamed the black manservant for messing something up in the kitchen. Everyone felt really sorry for her, holed up in her house alone after her father died and her boyfriend ran off. And they were too polite to tell a lady to her face that her house smelled, so a bunch of town men decided to help her out with a gorilla lime sprinkling to remove the smell. Hooray! It's hard to imagine that the townspeople didn't realize on some level what she did. Certainly the pharmacist realized, and the collective narrator might understand what the implication was of the message for rats, because they knew about it and find it worth bringing up in the narrative, but they don't articulate it. I think Sunnydale syndrome is in effect, and the townspeople are in deep denial, but not ignorance. After Homer left her, Emily became a recluse. She very rarely left the house, and mostly only had her manservant for company. The decades passed. The town came to know her as a tough old woman with long silver hair. And then she died. They have a funeral. 4 days later, they force open the door to her bedroom, and they find Homer, lying in bed in the clothes he was to wear when he was married, now a dried-up mummy. And beside him is an imprint, with one long silver hair. Wow, that's disturbing. They didn't have mattresses that poof back? Emily had no back support for many years? The horror! Yep. Emily couldn't bear for Homer to leave her, so she thought that she would keep him forever. Living Homer is a rat to be killed, but dead Homer is eternally lovely. Some people interpret the title as meaning that Homer is a pressed rose. While this was not the author's intention, the fact that it works is interesting. It's a case of turning the gaze, making the man the objectified one in a manner similar to Snow White, which is horrifying in part because it's an inversion of traditional gender roles. Even though Emily is the villain, a reprehensible murderer, she has a strength as a woman that makes her attractive as a female character, in a manner similar to Carmilla. Feminists can like her as a figure who defies gender roles. It's implied that both Emily's father and Homer were not nice men, despite what the stupid townspeople characterized them as. And after men abusing her most of her life, Emily takes control of her life. The assumption that Homer was straying is an implication of the unreliable collective narrator that could have been applied retroactively following his disappearance. Homer was possibly just an abusive jackass, and that ambiguity leaves room to make Emily an appreciable figure in her villainy. The townspeople assume Emily to be naive and innocent, but she's not. They assume she doesn't understand the tax situation, but it's implied that she knows she's supposed to pay and just uses the assumption of ignorance and the strength of her social status to keep from getting in trouble. She found the ability to be strong within the highly restrictive role that a woman had as a Southern aristocrat at the time. In acquiescing to Homer's pursuit, she broke a huge taboo about an aristocrat dating a member of the lower class, a Yankee carpetbagger. There's a note about the townspeople starting to gossip about it, but she held herself with such dignity that people soon forgot about the scandal and got interested in their upcoming engagement. In this sense, she is a bit of a subversive type, even as she generally fulfills the expectations of her social class. All of this makes her an attractive figure to a lot of feminists. I totally get it. Here's where I don't like it. She's racist. Just straight up racist. All of this other stuff can be hand-wavy, with an ambiguous, unreliable narration and death of the author, but it's very clear that she's just a big ol' racist. To glorify the figure of Emily for feminist appreciation is to treat racism as a blind spot and uphold white supremacy within feminism. Racist white feminism was a huge problem in first-wave feminism, the era that this story falls into, and it's something we're only just now really focusing on weeding out in modern third-wave feminism. From a modern perspective, Emily just doesn't work as a feminist figure. If you want a fun, somewhat feminist villain character without awful racist overtones, I'd direct you to, let's see, Carmilla, Carrie, Catwoman. I think the real problem here is that Emily's name doesn't start with C. Please remember to like, share, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and email me if you want to be put on a waiting list for a paid commission video.